Okay, so our next presenter is Adria Roberts. So Adria was born and raised in the Fraser Valley in British Columbia. She went to the University of the Fraser Valley for general studies before moving to Vancouver Island. She managed an organic farm and learned her family's Indigenous language during this time. In 2014, Adria Roberts was homeless for a year and struggling on the streets with psychosis. Initial support was troubling when heavy symptoms of paranoia, fear, and delusional thinking were constant. Eventually, Adria was connected to psychiatric care and mental health and started receiving support to manage her symptoms. Today, Adria's presentation is called Lost in Reality, My Journey with Clozapine. So Adria, I'm just going to stop my share and hand it over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me well? Thumbs up. Great. Thank you for having me today. So my name is Adria. I'll be sharing a little bit about my mental health story and what it's like for me to have been diagnosed with schizophrenia, depression, and anxiety, and also what being medicated on clozapine was like for me a little bit. I kind of wanted to touch on something that our first presenter had shared, Dr. Mate. It was lovely to hear from you. Something just stood out for me, and I wanted to mention it. When you said people don't care what you know if they see you don't care about what you know, that really stood out for me, and kind of I took it personally for how I felt and also for like moving forward, that to care about what I do. So I wanted to say thank you for that. So I'll be sharing a little bit of what my mental health journey was like. So in 2012, life was pretty good for me. I had recently moved to Vancouver Island and was getting to know my Indigenous heritage out there in the West Saanich Peninsula area. I was also a manager of an organic farm over there for a period of time. Life was really good for me. I was really enjoying myself, and I kind of saw a bright future for myself in what I was doing at that time. I had grown up pretty secluded from other people. I had been homeschooled. My parents were very religious, so I didn't have a lot of connections to other people with how to interact with others. So at that point in my life, I was pretty young. I was about 21, 22 at the time. I started to hang out with people and recreationally smoking marijuana. I didn't have a problem with it at the time. I didn't think about any long-term effects to it. I was thinking, because I was so into organics and natural things, that I thought it was just like kind of a hippie thing to do. And it was great. I was having a really good time, quite high all the time. And I didn't notice anything besides just kind of being happier and more calm. So I didn't think anything would happen. As I was working on the organic farm, I started to notice that I would hear things around me, like the trees, the sun, the ocean was starting to talk to me. And at that point in my life, I was a very spiritual person in my own way. And I thought, oh, I'm finally connecting to the land like my ancestors, because that was super important to me. I didn't think at any point I was being delusional. I thought I was having an awakening or that it was a divine experience. So I was pretty excited at that point. I was continuing to do what I thought was well in life. I was showing slight symptoms of manic behavior, but I didn't even know what that was back then. And because I was no longer as anxious, I kind of thought that actually I was going uphill. Still hearing different things around me speak to me. It would be kind thoughts for the most part. It would be like, you're doing great, keep going, we love you. Eventually, it did have a flip. And I was so shocked to have that happen, where it became not so much the land talking to me, but it felt like outward voices coming inward. It did not feel like it was within me at all. It felt like an external source. And I couldn't place where the voices were coming from, but I assumed it was telepathic. It had a range of different, what I thought sources were. Some of it were political leaders, some of them were celebrities, like Will Ferrell, Emma Thompson, Neil deGrasse Tyson was one of my favorites. So I was kind of excited, but also a little bit in fear, but still thinking this had a grand purpose, that I was still connecting to a greater source. Um, and then some of the voices, I had no clue where their source was. I could just feel their personality, and it just felt like thoughts I'd never had before. So I did not think at all it was from my own ways of thinking. It felt like outward sources. Um, as I was living on the island, it was getting worse and worse, but I was in some sort of denial. I wouldn't tell people what I was experiencing, and I'm pretty chatty, so that definitely was a warning sign. But there was this one night, some of you may have heard this before when I've shared, but there was this one night I had not been sleeping. I was quite manic and delusional, and there was several voices. I used to say it would be 20 to 30 voices. It was just an overwhelming amount of voices, and they would interact with each other and me, and they wouldn't let me sleep. They wanted attention all the time. I was extremely tired at that point, and I asked all the voices if they could leave, and they said, "We'll leave if you go outside." I was inside a space at the time. I was kind of couch surfing at that point. So I did go outside, and it had been quite a while of hearing voices, and all of a sudden I heard none. And that feeling from hearing so many voices all the time to none, it was the most peaceful thing I had ever felt in a long time. And I just remember feeling, oh, I'm gonna be okay. And then as soon as I went back in, the voices were, haha, got you. Like they had tricked me. And I just remember that devastation rolling in, and I've been tricked and I'm screwed kind of went through my head. But then I kind of went in and out of delusion and clarity and awareness. Sometimes I had no stuff was going on with me, and other times it's like I didn't even have any perception of what was going on. I ended up becoming homeless because I wasn't able to stay within a space for very long. And I was also unaware of all that was happening. I didn't clue into the fact I was homeless 100% for quite some time. And I was fearful of authority figures. I didn't want to engage with anyone who would try to help me in a professional way. Eventually, I decided to go for a walk, and there would be walks I would do with the voices. They tell me to go on a walk because they would tell me like it was part of my destiny to do this walk, and that something would unfold by doing so. And I thought it was like a universal, like a universe purpose. I just, I didn't know fully what it was, but I just had some strong urge to believe it was a monumental thing to do. So the voices led me to my friend's place. It was about a 2 hour walk, and I was guided by them to the back of my friend's yard. I didn't even know if my friends were home. I just literally walked into their backyard. Not something I would normally do. And they had a shed, and the voices said, "Go in the shed. There's a shovel." My brain still doesn't know how they knew there was a shovel, except that most sheds have shovels. And so they told me to grab the shovel, and there was a window. And I remember the Britney Spears photo, poster that was in there, and they told me, smash that window and go in there for safety. I was like, okay, here we go. And I see my friend from the corner of my eye. We make eye contact, and I'm like, and then my friend's looking at me in disbelief. I don't think he knew I was psychotic. I didn't know I was psychotic. And then I realized I have to leave. So I ran as quick as I can from my friend's space. Eventually, my friend caught up to me and contained me from moving. And I could hear them saying, "Oh, should we call the police?" And they're like, "No, something's not right with her. Let's just bring her to the hospital." So they brought me to the hospital, and I waited in emergency for several hours. I, in reflection, remember myself laughing hysterically and thinking everything was funny. And it was like I was acting very inappropriate. Eventually, I got brought to a room to talk to, I think it was a psychiatrist, and they were trying to talk to me about like what was going on with me. They thought maybe I was on several substances. At that point, I had been smoking weed and drinking a lot of caffeine. Those were the two substances I was using, but they were concerned it might be several other ones. And then the voices tried to take over my verbal dialogue. It felt like, I'm not a professional, but that's what it felt like. So I started to spasm and tremor, and so they ended up having to strap me down. And it just when people talk about people who have being diagnosed with schizophrenia, that some people's perception is we have demons. That's what it felt like at that point, was a bunch of evil spirits trying to say whatever they want through my own vocals. Eventually, they sedated me and put me in seclusion. And I remember sitting on that mattress on the floor. It was a completely white room. It felt like a jail cell, and there was a toilet right beside it. And I just remember feeling like an animal. I mean, I knew in reflection, like I was not good and they needed to do something, but I do remember how horrible that felt. And then seeing them peek in the little square window, I felt really dehumanized. Eventually, they brought me to the psych ward, and the psychiatrist there told me I was exhibiting signs of schizophrenia. And then I knew I did not want to be there. I did not want to associate myself with someone who struggled, or especially would be seen as having schizophrenia. That just felt like the worst thing ever. So I knew I need to act as normal as possible. So for 4 days, I tried to hold in as much of my symptoms as possible. And they seemed to think I had a huge improvement. So they ended up discharging me after 4 days. And I went to being homeless straight away. And I was delusional because I didn't think I was homeless. I remember, even though I didn't have anywhere to stay, I still thought things were somewhat okay. Eventually, I went to a park, and I would often hang out in this park and have naps in it. And there was some kids skateboarding, and I wanted to be able to connect with people, but I was horrible at connecting with people at that point because I didn't make a lot of sense, but I still somewhat craved it in and out. So I tried talking to them, and one of the young men said, are you high on meth?" And he's like giving me like a disgusted, like bothered look. And I just remember in that moment thinking, I look like someone who's on meth. And I couldn't believe that is what I had become. I was thinking, my life used to be so great. Like all of a sudden, I'm like, what happened? And I remember being devastated that someone would say that. At that point, I wasn't smoking marijuana anymore because I knew it somewhat affected me in a negative, even if I didn't want to admit it. I just couldn't handle being on it anymore. But I was still psychotic, not knowing what psychosis really is. And I remember sitting in that park thinking, wow. And then all of a sudden, my mind cued in, you're homeless. This is not good. And then my mind thought, wow, I've been thinking I'm like like I'm this grand person on this high universe mission, but here I am homeless, and people think I'm on meth. And that was just like the worst feeling to be to have kind of lied to myself and then have that feeling of like, wow, I have been so tricked in my head. Um, and even though I had that moment, it's pivotal now, but it wasn't pivotal then. I still would go into delusion and do other things. But it did that moment did happen, and it did pivot my life later on. I kept being homeless for quite a long time. I didn't trust anyone except other people who were homeless, oddly enough, which is, looking back, is interesting to me. But because of my ancestry on my mom's side, I was willing to go to a First Nations band to talk to someone about a lot of my thoughts I had. I was hallucinating from what the voices would say, and the voices were telling me I had a lot of trauma that now I don't believe is true, but because of the hallucinations and the voices confirming it, I did believe it. So I went to talk to a nurse practitioner about it and say, oh, this is what's happened to me, and then kind of explain to her what I thought was going on, which probably wasn't fully going on. And I remember her because she did not make me feel like, I if you've ever seen someone, they're like, you can tell they won't say it, but they're insinuating with their body language, and what you thinking isn't quite right. But she didn't do that. She let me share how I saw things and validated how I felt about what I was going through. So I have a lot of respect for her wherever she is, and she connected me to mental health, and then I was finally willing to go to mental health, and I went to mental health, and I was talking a mile a minute back then. I still talk a lot, but back then it barely made sense. And I saw a psychiatrist, and I talked to many social workers and case managers, not sure what their full background was. And I eventually got diagnosed at end of 2012 with schizophrenia, depression, and anxiety. I was somewhat okay about being diagnosed with depression and anxiety because I feel we all have that in some level. Like, we all struggle with being depressed at times and anxiety. And it didn't have as much stigma on it. If I told someone I was depressed, people would be like, yeah, we know what that is, kind of thing. With schizophrenia, I just felt like, great, now me and everybody else I know knows I'm crazy. And yeah, it was just an awful feeling. I had talked to a nurse after I got diagnosed, and she was talking about having to be on medication. And she said, you will most likely be on medication for the rest of your life. In my head, I was like, I was managing an organic farm, and now I am on pharmaceuticals for the rest of my life, with no like in transitional housing. Like, this is like what happened. And I started crying, and she said, see, you're not okay. And I said, yeah, I'm not okay. um, and then I tried to keep existing in some sense after that diagnosis. I did get put on disability, which is such a blessing. But I kind of no longer cared about life. I started to isolate really bad. I would stay within my own space for 2 weeks at a time, wouldn't shower for a week or two at a time. I just didn't have any passion for being alive anymore. And it was a struggle to find the right kind of medication because my symptoms had become so high. They were every few months they would try to adjust my meds or switch it slightly, and nothing seemed to be working. My symptoms with hearing voices, even though I was no longer smoking marijuana, no longer drinking caffeine, they were just showing still. So life felt really crappy, and I just no longer wanted to connect with life. Eventually, I did get put on clozapine, and I was very complacent by that time, so I did follow through with it. I found it extremely exhausting to go through the process of being put on clozapine. I was put on clozapine once I was in transitional housing, so I wasn't in psychiatric care at that point. But having enough energy to go to the hospital, get the ECG, get all the blood work, connect with the doctor, the case manager, was extremely overwhelming for me. But I did do it. At that point in my life, I didn't have any family support. My family, after what happened and what some of what I believed and said in psychosis, they decided they couldn't handle, not even not handle, they just needed to take care of themselves. And in order to do that, they couldn't connect to me. So for several years, I was just me, my psychiatrist, and my case manager, and that was also a really awful feeling, even though I'm very grateful for my professional team I had. So as I was living life, I was very sedated on the meds I was on. Clozapine was just one of them. I gained a lot of weight. When I was in the psych ward, I was 90 pounds. I didn't even notice I got that little until someone told me. And then within about 2 years, I was over 200 pounds. I'm not sure if clozapine is the full reason why I gained weight. I'm pretty sure it's a mixture of different reasons why I gained so much weight, besides having depression and also not really caring about life anymore and no longer moving around as much. But that was really hard, being from being thin to obese. I eventually met my current fiance, which was a huge thing for me because I didn't have any support that was more emotional based at the point. And I tell this story every time, and people like it. I was scared to tell him. So I have some like mental health things going on. I just didn't. I noticed that when I would finally share that or disclose it, people would politely disappear. And I was like, I really like this guy. Like, here we go. Because I knew it wouldn't be healthy to hide it forever. As soon as I told him I have schizophrenia with so much anxiety, he's like, oh, we all got shit going on. We all have some type of shit going on. And I was like, oh, he normalized it so fast for me. I was so thankful for that. And so we're still together now. So it's been 7 years. So he's definitely been a huge part of my support. I was doing okay in life. I wasn't working. Eventually, I did want to start working. I had sit and not worked for several years while on disability, and I wasn't thrilled about my life, but I was, I guess, okay about my life. So I started to connect with my case manager, and my case manager said, we need to get you less isolated. And I was like, I don't know that I really want to interact with people anymore, that sort of thing. I was pretty okay with what I had. And she said, no, we need to get you, to learn how to cope better with things. So she initiated that I would go to a local clubhouse. I did not want to go. I didn't want to be connected with other people who were also struggling. I kind of didn't want to admit I was struggling or see others that were struggling. But she wouldn't keep asking me to go. So I finally said, yes, I'll go. And I went, and it was okay. It wasn't great, but it wasn't bad. I was like, it's not the worst place ever. People are nice. And there was a band room. So that's what sold it for me. I was pretty young, and I was like, well, I want to play guitar one day. So that was the selling point for me. So then I started going every like 2 weeks, once a week, and then that's where I took WRAP, which is Wellness Recovery Action Plan. I signed up for that not even knowing what it was. I thought it was like RAP. I thought it was musical. I was gonna make some raps, but no, I was gonna make a wellness plan instead. But that was really good for me because at that point in my life, I didn't even think about having a wellness plan. I had stopped supporting myself. And when I took that training, I realized one of the concepts within that program is personal responsibility. I was like, I have given up on myself, and I'm upset that people don't support me how I want them to support me, but I won't even support my own self. And it took me so long to finally get to that thought. But that thought was huge for me. I was like starting to have more and more clarity about like what I'd went through and what I was kind of doing within my own headspace. I was still hearing voices within this period, but on Clozapine, uh, the voices incredibly decreased. There was a lot of side effects that were really, really hard on me. I started wetting myself, um, and I started having where I was scared to go outside, and I stopped exercising completely. But definitely the voices became more of like a random like I see you and like things like that randomly throughout the day instead of a constant like 24/7 feeling. So that was a positive. I didn't have the best perception about clozapine, but I don't know how many of us have a positive perception about medication when we don't want to be on it. So I will admit that. I feel that my doctor did say it was a last resort for me, and I think that made me feel like that maybe there's no saving me when he had said that. In reflection, I think it was a good thing I was on it. Later on in life, my mom passed away. That was 2019. And I had been on clozapine for quite a few years. And for the most part, I was pretty diligent about doing the blood work and things like that. Um, but I hated the side effects, and I didn't have really anyone to talk to about it. I felt like the psychiatrist was like, well, you have to take this because this is the thing that's helping the most. Unfortunately, there's a lot of side effects. So I just kind of felt I was devastated about wetting myself all the time and also that I was scared to be outside. But it was like either I'm going to hear voices all the time and be in paranoia, or I am going to have these side effects. I'm like, oh, they both sound awful. I guess this is life. So what ended up happening after my mom passed away is I completely lost it. I kind of had another crisis where all of a sudden I no longer was complacent. And I had been complacent for several years, doing exactly what my professional health team had told me to do. But then all of a sudden I no longer cared. I was like, I miss my mom. I don't know what to do. I can't cope. So I didn't tell anyone, but I went off all my meds and I was on clozapine. So you're supposed to go for blood work each month after the 6 month mark, um, and ECGs. But then I knew that if I went and did blood work, that they would see that there was no clozapine in my blood. Um, And so I knew if I went in, I would be admitting it. So I stopped going to my blood work. And I'm not sure how I got away with it, but for about 2, 3 months, I didn't go to my blood work appointments. And I stopped going to pick up my medication. My pharmacy started to call me and say, "Oh, you haven't been picking up your blood work. What's going on?" I'm not sure what happened on the other side for the pharmacy and my mental health side connecting, but for several months I was kind of trying to hide what I was doing. And then I started to go in withdrawal from not being on any of my medication at that time. I was on, I think, 4 or 5 meds, 4 other medications besides clozapine, and the withdrawal was awful. I used to sleep 12 to 14 hours a day on all my meds, which was also a struggle. But then all of a sudden, I was sleeping maybe 5 to 6, and it was not comfortable sleep. And my body was itchy, tingly for about 4 or 5 months. But all my side effects started to go away, and I became finally relieved, and I hadn't felt relief in about 6 years. Eventually, I told my fiance because I was in panic mode about not being on medication, and I was also panicked that I wasn't sleeping very well. And my fiance, he panicked and he says, "You have to talk to somebody about this." And then I started crying and I was like, "I don't know what to do." And he says, I said, I'm too scared to talk to my psychiatrist about what I'd done. But then I did, and my psychiatrist was like, "Oh, you're looking really good," because I had started to lose weight because I was no longer on meds. And I said, "Yeah, I'm not on my meds." I was like panic stricken, just blurting it out, and he gives me this look like you know better kind of look. And I said, I can't handle doing it anymore. And I think probably because my mom passing away, I just like all of a sudden couldn't do anything. Like I'm like, oh, I cannot do anything. And then he was really reasonable. He said, "We're gonna have to start the process all over again." And then my mind was terrified. I was like, every week having to go for blood work. I was like, I cannot do this. And I also was like, I cannot deal with the side effects. I'm thinking now, in reflection, that I was very alone with the side effects. That was the hardest part, is like, I can't be alone being terrified of outside, wetting myself, and not having anyone to understand it. So he tried to put me on a different medication for a period of time, just Abilify. He said he felt like I needed more support with medication, but because I was not willing, he's like, can we at least have you be on something? And I said, okay, I will try. Um, and then that I didn't do very well with. So I saw my psychiatrist a few months later. He thinks I'm still looking great. And I said, "I'm so sorry, I couldn't stay on Abilify either." And he says, medication stays within your body for many, many months, even if you stop. It makes sense that you still feel good, but eventually you will no longer have that medication supporting you with any of your symptoms. And so I decided I'm going to try to be off all meds and see what happens. And I talked to my case manager and I said, if I psychose again, can I come back? And if I talk to my support system and they all know that I've decided not to take meds and they tell me that I need to see about going back on them, can I come back? I was terrified that they were going to like stop supporting me because I was not willing to do what they advised. But they said, of course, you can come back. And then I felt a lot better. By that point in my life, I was working almost full time in mental health for peer support. This was all kind of going on at the same time. And I feel like a big part of why I'm still not on medication, it's been almost 3 years. I think a big reason why I have been able not to be on medication has been because of working within mental health and being able to talk about what I've gone through. I do feel that if I do need to go back on medication, I would say yes to it, even though I wouldn't want it, and that I would follow what my supporters' advice would be. If they're noticing you have a lot of symptoms going on, we're really worried about you, that I would heed their advice. So that's a little bit of my story of what I've gone through with struggling with my mental health. Now I work full time in mental health. I am one of the assistant managers for the peer support program with Communitas. I also facilitate a Hearing Voices group. It's been going for 7 years. And I recently started working for Chillax Supportive Housing Society, which is housing for people who struggle with their mental health to have affordable housing so they don't have to stress about where they have to live, because we know how hard it is to have housing nowadays that's affordable. So that's a little bit about me. Thank you for listening.
Thanks a lot, Adria. That's a very personal story. Thanks for sharing all the private details. I really appreciate you taking time. And I just want to let everyone know here that Adria has actually offered to speak to us and talk about all the positive and the negative experiences she had. So it was at her instance, we were always looking for clients to come and talk to us, but she took the initiative. So you understand how motivated she is. And she has, Adriel, not want to speak for you, but she has kind of offered to represent clients or help with this process as well. On that note, I know we have run quite a bit over time, but I think I have a very important question for Adria. I can't let this opportunity go. Adria, I wanted to ask you one question. If you had any advice for all the clinical teams here, you can just say it in 1 point, or if you want, maybe you can go up to 3 points. Uh, would you be willing to give us any thoughts or advice when we are kind of taking care of people who are who've been similarly ill?
Would you be basing it off of eventually trying to see if clozapine might be an option for them, or is it just in general with their mental health struggles?
In general, I think with your experience with clozapine, starting it, or how it went, or what you uh, think might help best the clients who are in a similar situation like you, or who have been. You're doing well now, but I mean, yeah, when you were.
I struggle with answering this question just because I know that when someone's struggling, it's hard for them to accept the support that they might need to choose because they don't want that specific type of support based off it being medication or otherwise. If I could go back to how I would have liked to have been supported while knowing that I had to try clozapine, I think that if I had someone saying, if you need to talk about being on this medication and how that's making you feel, we got you. Not to feel so alone, because I felt really alone about it. I know that's really hard because the mental health system is quite overwhelmed with trying to support people. I've mentioned this already. It would be lovely to have a support group that's even member led for like people who are on clozapine to support each other with like coping with medication side effects. I don't know how to explain how hard it is to cope on side effects. It's its own like kind of demon. Symptoms are awful, but so are side effects. It's hard if someone can't really identify with the side effects. And just what Dr. Mate had said earlier, that's kind of why I resonated with it, is if the professionals, it's great when they have a lot of knowledge, but if they don't care about why they're offering that knowledge, it's felt. I'm sure you guys have heard that so many times. And I myself struggle with compassion fatigue, so I would feel I were in your space, it would be really, really hard. But having someone just be like, I see you and I hear you, is so important.
Thank you, Adria. I think you said it well. So what you're saying is like you wish there was kind of more support for you when you were going through this difficult challenge with all the side effects and all the kind of requirements that you had. So on that note, I will leave it here. I know we are pretty much behind time. Let you guys post questions in the chat room. I'll pass it back to Philip. Thank you, Adria, again. Appreciate your time.